Welcome. Really happy to have you here for this conversation. Hopefully we will generate some great ideas together. And you can see my original title for this session of Step Away from the Screen is what we have here. And here's what we're going to do. Let's start out just by introducing ourselves. And here's what we're looking to know. Who are you? What or where is your work? What's your M² connection? And one question that you're bringing to this conversation. And at the moment, since it's, I think looking at the numbers, it's just, it's Debbie and Melinda, and Emily and I are here. So let's start with Debbie. Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Debbie Cooper. I'm the Director of Engagement for PJ Library. Their national office is in Western Massachusetts, but I work remotely based in Chicago, where I live with my family. I participated in M² senior educator cohort. I honestly don't know if it was 2 or 3. I don't know what, are you in 4 now? I don't know. In any event, I participated in that when I was still with Federation. I worked for a local federation for about 15 years before that, before moving into this role. And one question I'm bringing to the work is, and I don't know if this work is based on Tiffany Schlane's book, 24/6, or not, but a friend introduced me to that book, and it sort of really resonated for me personally. It's a practice that I sort of started with my own family, and now in this sort of crazy pandemic time, we are talking about how we might bring that to our PJ Library family network to see if this is something that we can embrace. I guess the questions I have are there ways to broaden it beyond just technology? Like, that was sort of my question, is like that might not resonate with everybody. And so as we think about that sort of making Shabbat different, what other lenses can we give toward it beyond just sort of, you know, taking away your screens?
Great, thanks. Melinda.
Hello, I am a rabbi in Cleveland. I am the director of J-Hub, which is an initiative of our local federation, providing new ways for interfaith couples and families to explore Jewish. My connection to M² is I was in SEC 3 and am in the current relational learning cohort. And I have found, I think that Shabbat resonates even more with our people, like with J-Hub participants. So we've been finding or thinking of different ways to kind of uplift Shabbat and different ways to connect and reach out to our families. And so, you know, that's been on our minds for a while. And so I wanted to join and see, you know, what takeaways I might find from here that might apply to what we're offering, or, you know, hopefully give me some new ideas.
Great, thanks. Emily, you want to introduce yourself? And obviously, if you have a question, you can throw it into the mix too.
So I'm Emily Faber. I'm new to M² as of January. I guess, you know, the very topic of this conversation was intriguing to me. I know I'm here on a support role, but every day does feel the same. So how do you differentiate and maintain uniqueness to Shabbat when we're always here, always, always with our family right now?
Right, absolutely. Great, thank you. So again, I'm Elyse Winick. In my day job, I oversee learning and education for Combined Jewish Philanthropies, which is the federation in Boston. And my M² connection is I'm an alum of SEC 1. And since then, I have mentored in a number of different programs, as well as done some curricular development and teaching, and kind of M² is my sanity. I came from a very long career doing direct service work on campus. Federation work is a few steps removed, but with M² I still have the luxury and the pleasure of being an educator myself, and really being part of people's professional journeys, which is really exciting. And I would say I'm bringing a lot of questions to this conversation, but if I'm going to hone it down to one, it's the question of not only what can we take out of Shabbat and the experience of Shabbat that can be transformational about what our current experience is like, but also what can we learn that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise, that we can then use when whatever the new normal is established, and what that's going to look like going forward. So we have a couple of things we're going to try to accomplish together today. Ideally, I'm going to switch to the next screen. Next slide. Oh, now, oh, there we go. So the first thing, this is, hang on, went 2 slides ahead. There we go. The framing. What's a brain trust? Why is that what this session is called? And the idea is that unlike the deep dive webinars, which are much more content focused, the brain trust, though it'll be structured with content, and I hope you'll find it valuable, it's much more about the conversation that we're going to have, and the content is there to kind of inspire our conversation and to help us take meaning and share meaning out of the conversation. Why are we talking about Shabbat? Well, as Jewish educators, we are frequently talking about Shabbat. That's obvious. It's a core element of, for many people, practice, but certainly the ebb and flow of Jewish time. And it makes sense to be reflective on how Shabbat is experienced in the course of what we're currently going through, but because I also think that there are some really unique aspects of what we're experiencing that both highlight the value of Shabbat, but can use Shabbat as a reflection back out into the rest of our lives. And I think that the specific issues now have so much to do with, well, let's do it this way. You want to throw out ideas for particular Shabbat issues that come up for you in the current crisis. Some of it came out of your questions in the beginning, this notion of spending so much time with technology, this notion of Shabbat as a particularly resonant category right now for a lot of people. We're seeing really remarkable numbers of increase in Shabbat service participation online, and other ways in which people are using the kind of existing construct of Shabbat as a time for community, as a way to find meaning and wholeness and connection right now. Other things that you think are unique to right this moment about Shabbat? You do not have to raise hands. We're a small enough group. Just speak up. We'll pause if pausing is necessary for one another.
So I think this is an issue which is probably not like super widespread, but we had sort of 3 months ago starting more, and we've always had a Friday night dinner, more of a Shabbat practice where we've been stepping away from screens, shutting down, spending more time on games, sort of like, again, like what's laid out in the book, and it had been working really well for us. And so now I'm seeing that my kids are saying, but now that I don't see my friends all week, it's really hard when you tell me I can't use my phone on Saturday, because that's how we're connecting and that's what we're doing. So I'm almost seeing for our particular family, the wanting the screens back on Shabbat for connection, because my kids are just so hungry for connection anyway. And then they like calling me out on the technicality of like zooming into our, Shabbat services.
Right.
It's like, well, what happened to no technology, Mom? So, and then once you turn it on, even for a screen to zoom into, you maintain sort of that, sanctity, even if the Zoom is for, right? Because your emails pop up or other things.
Right. Very true. Linda, do you want to add anything? You don't have to.
It's interesting because my experience is a little different with technology in that it's even more pronounced now that I'm working from home and working, like many of us, like all hours a day, every day of the week. So for me, I'm more inclined actually to leave my phone on Shabbat than I would have in the past, because it like forces me to disconnect. Otherwise it's like constant work. So,
Right.
and that's not healthy. So, so I'm kind of more mindful of it in that regard.
Mhm.
I'm not, I mean, we're probably Saturdays tends to be when we, as a family, venture out of the house, like to go for a walk, for a hike, or something like that. So, I mean, that's kind of nice. It's not something. I mean, we often would have done it before, but it just feels different now, right? It's just more emphasized, I guess, because otherwise, the five of us, my family, is all in our various rooms inside the house together.
Right. Well, we're gonna talk about actually some interesting pieces, interesting things that are raised by what each of you is saying, but also by the relationship between what you're each saying. And we're gonna have, hopefully, three primary areas of conversation here, each inspired by a different, let's call it a different text. And we'll see. I recognize we started late. I'm available to stay a little bit longer. I'm not going to presume that other people are, but if we, feel the need to extend a little bit and people are able to, then I'm certainly happy for us to do it. So let's take a look at our first text. Melinda, as it happens, you're still on my screen since I only see one person at a time during the screen share. So can I ask you to read the text for us?
Sure. Judaism is a religion of time, aiming at the sanctification of time. Unlike the space-minded man to whom time is unvaried, iterative, homogeneous, to whom all hours are alike, qualityless, empty shells, the Bible senses the diversified character of time. There are no 2 hours alike. Every hour is unique and the only one given at the moment, exclusive and endlessly precious.
So, what we're looking at here is a quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath. If it's not a book that you've read before, I certainly want to encourage you to read it. It's short. It's probably it's definitely under 200 pages. I think it might even be under 180 pages. It's very poetic, and it really talks about getting to Shabbat not through the ritual practices of Shabbat, but through kind of the goal sounds too utilitarian, but the experience of Shabbat, what Shabbat has to offer us in terms of how we feel and what we're engaged with by experiencing Shabbat, more so than it's about any kind of ritual. So when you look at this text, what about it jumps out to you as particularly salient in this moment? What about this text enables you to kind of categorize what some of the challenges are right now?
This specific quote actually speaks to me less about Shabbat and just time in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the end of it, the exclusive and endlessly precious.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've been talking a lot about gratitude, and even though we all may have our concerns, anxieties, worries, whatever our obstacles are right now, taking the moment, like appreciating the moments and finding the bright spots and really acknowledging them because they are exclusive and endlessly precious. That's what's resonating with me from this.
Debbie, do you want to add something? I was going to refer to some of the language, but.
Sure. I was going to say, if you look at sort of like a day of normal meetings, you might describe your day as unvaried, iterative, homogeneous, empty shells. Like those tend to describe some of the, day, not all, but some of the days that, I have or feel like staring at Zoom. I have found myself adding things like this every couple days a week to try, and also my own way of like breaking up time and trying to make, like I maybe said similar to Melinda, like bright spots, like during my things I can look forward to. And so I really appreciate the idea of like the sanctification of it. And it's sort of like, you don't have to go for perfection. Not every to be bliss. And, but I think it's a differentiation between the moments, right? You're going to have things that feel hard and feel boring, and your kids are going to fight, work is going to be stressful, and you're going to have these bliss things. And so how are you just like aware that, of like different moments in time? It feels like it's somewhat attainable ideal that's held up. It's not perfection, it's just distinct.
Right. Well, and I think that's really important. First of all, if there's any mantra that we should all be carrying with ourselves during this, it's the notion of the perfect being the enemy of the good, because any limitations we had on achieving perfection before, which I think were there and we often would deny them, are exponentially greater right now, because the circumstances from practical perspectives limit our ability to achieve what we would feel is perfection, the ways in which we feel emotionally depleted by the situation and by the demands on us. So for all of that, I think that the perfect being the enemy of the good is kind of the watch phrase that we should all have kind of tattooed on the inside of our eyelids. But I was struck, and why I chose this quote and went searching for it is this chain of words: unvaried, iterative, homogeneous. As Jewish professionals, we are always on a very, very fine edge between the distinctions between the personal and the professional. Part of it is because the nature of our work is very much about putting ourselves in it, and the things about Jewish experience that compel us to be educators are things that compel us personally as well as professionally. So here we are in this circumstance where our homes and our offices are now the same. And even if you've worked remotely in the past, which, and I certainly spent many years working from a remote office, but even if you've worked remotely in the past, there's a certain quality of being utterly and totally unable to make a distinction between the two. You may have worked remotely in the past, but you didn't have your kids home all day and try to figure out how to be I'm gonna go there just because of what we said earlier, but the being a perfect parent and a perfect professional, you don't usually have, you have moments in time where those two things come into tension with one another, but it's not constant. So this notion of time being unvaried, iterative, and homogeneous, I cannot think of a way in which we could experience time that is more like that than right now. And in that way, Shabbat becomes a critical element in trying to diversify our experience of time, in trying to make that distinction. So much in Judaism is about making distinctions, right? Between light and darkness, between day and night, between sacred and profane, all of these different ways in which we make distinctions to try to put order, impose order on the actual nature of the world as chaos. So we have to work really hard now to make a distinction between time, between one time and another. And I think that Shabbat then becomes useful as a way in which we can do that, but as a reminder of the need to do that and to hopefully inspire us to look for ways to do that at other times as well. And the thing that I think we need to give real attention here, and this comes back to Melinda, you're saying that that getting away from technology is important to your Shabbat experience, and Debbie, you're saying that for your kids, in some ways, using technology may be important for their Shabbat experience. I think we have to think about two really important factors here. One is, well, I'm going to distill them actually into single one, which is that notion of distinction, of making time different, can have any number of different kinds of manifestations. And we shouldn't be presuming that that one thing makes the time distinct and another doesn't. So it may be that stepping away from technology really is what makes it different. And it may be that using technology with a certain set of limitations may be what makes it different. And it may be that, you know, technology for the purposes that you define as Shabbat related, yes, but technology for the things that you do all the rest of the week, no, right? I find myself really having to force myself not to check emails after 10 o'clock at night or before 7 in the morning, not because I should be checking email as early or as late as those times anyway, but because I know that I do it. How do I keep work out of at least some period of time that is my night? So I think that Shabbat pulls us in those directions of figuring out what's the quality of time? How do we make time distinct? And relative to that, I would also say that, yes, Shabbat, and I say this as a person who is Shabbat observant, Shabbat is a 25-hour time block. And if what's going to work for our families is to create distinction for some piece of that 25-hour time block, and it's not the full 25 hours, that may be the goal, right? But it's also about how you can make it happen and how you can make it work. And this is one of those places where we really can't afford to have the perfect be the enemy of the good. Any thoughts here before we go on to the next segment?
I'll add one thing that the way that my rabbi has always talked about Shabbat, which was so helpful to me, is I always, understood from growing up and even day school as like, this is the day you, like the song, like this is the day you work and on Yom Shabbat you rest. And it never like resonated in any kind of deep way. And the way that she sort of described it to me, or she described it to everybody sitting in the room at the time, was all the rest of the week, so many of us do work that's like trying to change the world and like trying to make things different than they are. And like Shabbat is like the one day that we can say, we just accept the world as it is. So that frame for me, which is I think obviously a little bit, it is work and play, work and rest, was so helpful to me, especially during this time, and why I've taken Shabbat for myself, even if my kids are choosing to go, because we are all working so hard to try and repair things for people, to try and protect people, to try and hold other people. That just feels like important. Like I'm also the chair of my day school in town, and it is such a heavy burden right now, blessing burden right now, that it's like I'm always trying to hold it together for everybody else and change it and make sure that we don't fall apart or families aren't able to access a school and whatever else. And it's the one day where I can say, Shabbat, like we're living through a pandemic. You don't need to solve anything today. You can sort of just be yourself and take your time. And the Shabbat gives me like that cover and protection for myself and my own self to like try to continuously solve for other people. And it's when I realized like, oh, I need to do it for myself too.
Great. All right, I'm going to move us to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to play a YouTube video of a piece of music, and you may have to adjust your volume. This is something on Zoom I have yet to really master. The song is in Hebrew. There'll be subtitles, translation, and we'll come together when the song is over and talk about what thinking does this inspire relative to this conversation about Shabbat. So let's talk about this particular source, this text. What in the messaging of this song strikes you as relevant to this conversation around Shabbat? Right, so here's the lyrics talk about everything that you're seeking is somehow inside you, and the manifestation of your dreams is an ability that lies within you already. Debbie, I see you unmuted.
Sure, it's like the telltale sign.
Yeah, it's good.
One is I never knew that they did anything other than covers on YouTube. It was like nice to see. I love them. The only thought that I had to me that was like very visceral and connected was like time and a space for those things to happen. That like if all these things are it's a very like M squared thing, right? You need time for reflection. You need to process it. You need to be quiet in order to make sense of what you're doing in life and what's happening and all those things around you in order to maybe like live your fullest. And so I just thinking about how like Shabbat is a day when all those things might be like taking place and you're giving your chance yourself, you know, to rest, and connections are being made that you wouldn't make otherwise.
I think this notion of quiet is really critical because in part because of the inability to really have a full distinction between personal and professional, in part because this, while on one hand, the Zoom connections really are a tremendous benefit because we get to see people's faces and feel more connected in that way, being present on Zoom, excuse me, is also remarkably more draining than being present, actually physically present with another human being or a group of people. And that means that layered with the attendant and totally expected anxieties associated with the crisis, whether it's about our own health or the health of people whom we care about, or if it's about job security, as it is for so many people, or if it's about, am I going to make it through this Zoom call without being interrupted by one of my office mates, i.e. one of my children or pets. That low level of, well, that anxiety exists for us all the time. Sometimes it's in the forefront, and sometimes it's just this low level agitation that we're not necessarily even aware of or conscious of, but it is depleting us, and it has us, I think, living on more heavily on in this kind of fight and flight mode, that's occupying more of our energy in the background of everything that we do than it ordinarily does. And this opportunity that Shabbat both provides and highlights of, if you clear other things away, what can you find? What will you discover about yourself? But not just in a practical sense, but what do you leave space for in that for yourself? So the song in particular is very much about what can you discover about yourself when you allow for that kind of stillness and quiet. But I think it also points out this incredible essential need right now for cultivating stillness and quiet. And again, not necessarily for all of Shabbat and not necessarily only on Shabbat, but what are the ways we can take what Shabbat has to offer us and use it to, and use that model as a way to kind of restore that stillness. I know that even in a regular week, for me, there's this moment from when I cover my eyes to light Shabbat candles until, or actually even like that very first moment that my eyes open again after I uncover them, before the world has started again. And that's a slice that I am always looking to recapture, because in that moment, it's all about the candlelight, right? It's all about just that moment. There's not a time, I think, ever that I'm as present as I am in that one moment. And the ritual of candlelighting is actually designed to focus your attention in exactly that way. So what are the ways that I can make space so that there's room for that stillness? And where do I make space? You know, this idea of dreaming in particular, and the value of being a person of dreams. Dreaming is a luxury right now, right? Dreaming is a luxury. Our brain cells are so actively engaged in, when can I get my next Instacart slot? And what, you know, did I wash my hands after I opened that piece of, whatever, that piece of mail? And that's, everybody's needs in this are different, but those kind of characterize the ways in which we don't really do anything without thinking. And dreaming happens to us as much as it comes from us. And what are we doing to make space for that dreaming to happen? Melinda, did you want to share anything?
I'm not sure. Back in reference to the song,
Sure.
I think about, you know, Shabbat kind of being its own world. And so everything kind of, you know, existing in that moment, and kind of linked to what Debbie had said previously. about like accepting things as they are, but I think there's something connected there in terms of Shabbat being that sanctuary and time concept.
Yeah, I apologize because of the screen share. I only see one face at a time. You don't have to speak if I call on you. Since I can't see you to know whether or not you want to. So just you feel free to say I'm good if you don't want to share anything. All right, we're going to go on to the next slide.
Elyse, I'll just add one thing. When I had to go on the camp,
Yeah.
convince my kids that we weren't going to be using screens on Shabbat, I had to approach each differently. And my older son, he's very creative and innovative, but I noticed as he's gotten more social and more on his screens, it's become less and less. And so I said to him, I was like, you know how when you tell me you get all your good ideas in the shower? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, well, because your brain's working in a really different way. You're not focusing, you're not thinking, you're not engaging, you're quiet. And so that's when you're coming with your ideas. I'm like, and so that was a way for him to figure out like why
That's
this
great.
might be important. Like our brains are just not used to, my brain certainly not used to quiet, or like even the concept of like, what is that? I don't know. Let me look it up. Like, what does it look like to wonder what something is and not find the immediate answer to?
Right. I mean, that's actually, you make an excellent point there. I find that it is, for me as a Luddite, one of the things I bemoan on the loss of the card catalog in the library, because half of the fun of looking something up in the card catalog in the library was what you found that you weren't looking for, that you didn't know existed. Whereas our searches in an electronic card catalog are obviously far more efficient, but that comes at a price. So where do we create that opportunity to get lost in things? All right, we're going to move on the next screen. Now, when I tried this earlier, I could not get this to show up. So I think in your chat window, you have the PDF to look at that Emily has posted for us. And this is an art exploration on positive and negative space. So I'm pretty sure right now I'm screen sharing and you're not seeing anything, but this is the way I can see it. And hopefully you've clicked on the link. And we'll just take a brief look. There are 12 slides here about positive and negative space in art. And this ties back into what we're saying. So what I'll do is I'll ask you to move to the next slide so that hopefully we are all more or less seeing the same thing at the same time.
And I'm sorry, is it sideways for y'all?
It is sideways, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
There might be a way to flip it. I wonder if you download it, if it'll flip. I don't know.
All right, well, I don't want to, we only have about 10 minutes to go, so I don't want to use too much of your time in that way. But what I will do, since I can see you won't get the images.
If you download it, do the quick download, then there's like, it shows up as a little bit of a PDF, and then you can actually reverse it on top. So it's the right way.
Thank you, Debbie. All right, so once you've got that, I'm on the second slide after the title slide that is describing what positive and negative space are in art. It opens with space and shape. Debbie, could you read that for us?
Sure. Space and shape, two of the elements of design, work together to form a finished work of art. There are two kinds of space, positive and negative. Positive spaces are those occupied by the main subjects of the work. The negative spaces are the areas around and behind the positive spaces. Negative space can also be referred to as the background.
Okay, so if you look at the images there, there's one where there's mostly background, there's one where it's roughly even, and there's one where there's mostly image. And the question is, from a design standpoint, from an art standpoint, how much negative space might one make use of to achieve the same goals that we do when we fill space? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Does this one have an image of scissors for you? Okay. Positive space is the areas in a work of art that are the subjects or the areas of interest. Negative space is area around the subjects or the area of interest. So if you look at how this image splits, either way you're looking at a pair of scissors. But in one case, you're looking at the pair of scissors as defined by how it fills the space. And in the other case, you're looking at the pair of scissors by how it's defined by what is missing from the space. So it becomes, I would say, even more pronounced if you want to go on to the next slide. If you look at the optical illusion slide that comes up, where it's a question of, are you looking at two faces or are you looking at a vase, right? Either way, you're looking at an image, but one is the image created by the positive space and one is the image created by the negative space, right? So if you're looking at the positive space, if we're assuming that the positive space is the white in this, then if your eye does this, I know not everybody's eye does this, then you're looking at a vase. And if you're looking at the negative space, which is the space around the vase, the dark space, the black space, then you're seeing two faces pointed toward one another. We're not going to go through all of the slides now, but I encourage you to take a look. There's some really nice and interesting artwork in here that plays this role of identifying positive space and negative space. And so I just wanted to throw that back out to you again. And we started to allude to it even when we were talking about this idea of making space in order to to experience the things that are there, that are hidden, that are obfuscated the rest of the time. And in the Shabbat term, I would throw out this idea, which is that my husband always talks about as he was growing up, thinking that Shabbat was a really negative time because it was all about the things that you couldn't do. And when he got to sleepaway camp, and it was a Jewish sleepaway camp, he discovered that Shabbat was actually about all of the things that he could do that he wouldn't have been doing the rest of the time. So that we can actually even look at the way Shabbat observance is characterized as either positive or negative with the same exact thing. Are the ways in which we might limit ourselves, limit our activities on Shabbat about the things we are held back from, or are they about the things they free us up to do? And I think that ties again back into this notion of how do you use that space to make it distinct, more so than the question of what is the specific way in which you're engaging with it. So I'll pause here if you guys have any thoughts about positive and negative space to build on as they relate to Shabbat.
I would just say maybe sometimes it's just hard. Am I muted?
No, I hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, I couldn't tell if I was muted. I think sometimes it just might be even hard to know at the beginning of like what constraints may help you, and you know what I mean, and what constraints. So just in thinking about sort of what the guidelines were for our family, it was just helpful to think about, well, are we going to use our phones when we're trying to meet other people and make plans, or should we try to that advance? Is that more of a convenience? And so I think sometimes just sort of challenging yourself to go even further than you might feels comfortable or whatever else might help you figure out what you actually, because the more I try to relax the rules for myself, the easier it is, like the blurrier lines. And so even though you might have right intentions, sometimes just that really sharp contrast is what you actually really need in order to sort of get I think the most, like the purest benefit of it, or something really different.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's really goes back to this, again, the perfect being the enemy of the good, is the idea that we might need to experiment to figure it out. And what works one week and what works the next week aren't necessarily going to be the same. And that applies whether we are, our goal is to observe Shabbat in a traditional context, or our goal is to translate those traditional practices into the ways in which Shabbat is going to be meaningful for us. But being conscious of the fact that what worked, in January doesn't necessarily work anymore in May, and what worked on, May 2nd isn't necessarily going to work on May 9th. So to be open to that and to open to the possibilities and less concerned about something precise. And that means that when something works, we worry less about the boredom and we bring it back as much as we can. There's I had a professor in rabbinical school, a Bible professor, who said that when it comes to Bible text, it's less that familiarity breeds contempt, as the expression would go, but more that familiarity breeds contentment. The idea of something familiar coming back over and over again, to a certain extent, that in and of itself provides some necessary stability. And it's about what's going to work for you and for the context that you're working with in any given moment, given what the other circumstances around it are. I want to just share this additional text about stillness. It's a quote from an article that was in the New York Times in 2012. Idleness is not just a vacation, an indulgence, or a vice. It is as indispensable to the brain as vitamin D is to the body, and deprived of it, we suffer a mental affliction as disfiguring as rickets. The space and quiet that idleness provides is a necessary condition for standing back from life and seeing it whole, for making unexpected connections and waiting for the wild summer lightning strikes of inspiration. It is, paradoxically, necessary to getting any work done. Idle dreaming is often the essence of what we do, wrote Thomas Pynchon in his essay on sloth. Archimedes' Eureka in the bath, Newton's apple, Jekyll and Hyde and the benzene ring. History is full of stories of inspirations that come in idle moments and dreams. It almost makes you wonder whether loafers, gold bricks, and no accounts aren't responsible for more of the world's great ideas, inventions, and masterpieces than the hardworking. So Debbie, this goes back to your discussion with your son about the ideas that are generated in the shower. This other component of the ways in which negative space are actually generative, right? The ways in which what we aren't doing allows us to be restored and renewed, so that in the time that we are trying to be productive, we're able to do that. So I would say that this also creates a bit of a caveat to what I said earlier in terms of, as long as you're making a distinction between Shabbat and the other days of the week, then you've accomplished what you're setting out to do. I think that is true, and along with that, the notion of cultivating stillness and cultivating quietude as a particular lesson about Shabbat time, as opposed to just a lesson about making distinction, I think is really critical. And we need to be conscious of both of those needs, and using the ability to make a distinction as a vehicle for cultivating that stillness, I think, is something that we can't ignore. We really can't ignore. So then brings us to our last slide, maybe. There we go.
Elyse, I'm sorry, I have to hop off because I have a
Sure.
1 o'clock, but thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's good to see everybody.
Thanks, Melinda. Good to see you too. So Debbie, I actually have a 1 o'clock coming up as well. But what I want to just highlight here is that the 3 different texts that we used were there both to frame our conversation, but also to inspire thinking about how those might be modalities that are actually useful to you in this notion of cultivating the stillness and making the time the time different. So there was kind of a form follows function idea to it, where the texts were both to help us progress in our thinking and deepen our thinking, but also as a way to inspire the conversation around what are the ways that we can be doing this. And this goes back very much to the point that you were making earlier about what are the ways that we do it aside from eliminating technology. And I think that to a certain extent, I would venture to say, to some extent, eliminating technology really is essential for a piece of that. And then the question becomes, what are the things that are fertile ground for this distinction in time and this need to, I'm sorry, cultivate stillness that are the next level of, we have eliminated the screen as the mode of communication and as the place where we're dwelling, and what do we fill in there? So, I'd say that if you have ideas now, I think I'm happy to kind of collect ideas, but if you think of things, we can kind of create a body of thought around that can be shared. Yeah, just the overall sense of Shabbat is always an important value. That stillness in Judaism it's always an important value. It's always an important piece of the flow of Jewish time. And I would suggest that in this moment, it actually it couldn't be more important, because it is really a reflection of so much of what we've had to sacrifice because of the essential needs of getting through the day-to-day during the crisis.
Thank you. That was really awesome to see some text around it. Have you read Tiffany's book?
I did. Yeah. It's a great,
Yeah.
It's a great book. And it does the same thing of saying, it's 24/6. It's not necessarily Shabbat as we might define it, but we have to kind of, in some ways, kind of push out our definition of Shabbat in order to try to achieve what it's talking about. And this notion, which very much comes from Heschel, of once we can capture it for Shabbat, what do we learn from it for the other 6 days of the week? It's not that every day should be Shabbat, but it's that how we interface with the world the rest of the week can really be affected by what we take from Shabbat.
Yeah, it's very funny. And I was talking to our content person. I said, after I read her book, I said, we should share this with the PJ community, but it can't be the only text that we put forth about Shabbat because it feels too. So we actually are thinking about pairing it with Heschel's Sabbath book, which was very fun.
I think it's great. I think it's a great idea.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Debbie. It was nice to speak with you. Take care.
Take care. Thanks, Emily, for your help.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.